Good morning. So we're trying to understand how is it that a finite physical human being is able to truly connect with the infinite God, with our limited capabilities? It's hard to understand. Even our soul, which we said is a part of God, but at the end of the day, it doesn't have complete oneness with God because it's an offshoot. It's a separate entity from God, having come down into this world like a child of God. But somehow, the Alter Rebbe taught us yesterday that when we study Torah or we perform a mitzvah, in other words, we take our faculties, our garments of our thoughts, our words, and our behavior, and we immerse them in the study and the practice of Torah and a mitzvah and doing things which the Torah approves of and encourages. Somehow, in those actions, in those deeds, we are truly connecting in a state of oneness with the infinite essence of God. As King David says in Tehillim, Suri echasebo, God is my rock, I will find refuge in him. You find refuge within somebody that you are a part of and you're truly connected with that person. Which is why we find something very interesting, a teaching in the Mishnah. The Mishnah asks, which world is greater? Our world, the physical world, or heaven, Gan Eden, Olam Haba? Now, most religions, most spiritual schools will tell you the world to come, the world in heaven, is a much more beautiful, greater, higher level world than our world. And yet the Mishnah teaches otherwise. The Mishnah says, living in this world, immersed in practicing the study of Torah and practicing the performance of a mitzvah, is much greater, is of greater benefit than living in heaven. Moreover, the Mishnah says, living even for just one moment here in this world, having studied Torah or practicing a mitzvah, is of greater benefit, greater value than the entire endless experience of living in heaven. Wow, that's a very unique Jewish view. And why is that? Because when you're in heaven, the experience there is finding delight, is finding connection with the light of God, the radiance of God. Now, the light of God is very powerful. A light is a reflection of the source of light. But at the end of the day, the light is just a manifestation of the source. It's not the source itself. And no matter how intense that light may be, but as we studied earlier, the further that a light shines, its power always gets diminished. And so the delight and the enjoyment of the experience in heaven is the delight of trying to understand God. Understanding something creates a lot of pleasure. But how much can you truly understand God? Impossible to understand God fully. Not only we down here with our human minds, it's impossible. Even our soul in heaven, with its soul mind, it's also impossible to fully understand the infinite essence of God. And so the understanding and the connection with that light will always be of a limited nature. However, here in this world, when we're studying Torah and doing a mitzvah, it's not just that we're trying to understand God, because we try to do that, but to do that fully and completely is impossible. It's more that we are actually trying to, or actually grasping God. There's a difference of understanding or of grasping. We cannot fully understand, but we can fully grasp the essence of God. Because as we learned, God compressed himself. He squeezed himself, his entire essence, within the Torah. And so the Torah down here, when we are performing a mitzvah or studying Torah, we're actually grasping, holding within ourselves the very essence, infinite essence of God's being. But you're going to ask, it's hard to appreciate that, it's hard to feel that, because the Torah, when it comes down here, it comes down and it's reflected in a very physical way, right? Doing a mitzvah, you're taking a physical object, blowing the shofar, shaking the lulav, lighting Shabbat candles, putting on the tefillin, doing a physical act of charity for somebody else. It's a very noble thing. It's a very special thing. But how is it that through that action, or through using my limited human mind to study a word or a passage of Torah, how is it that with that act that seems to be special but physical and limited, how is it that through that I'm creating a connection, a grasp of God far greater than the soul in heaven can ever fathom and appreciate God. So the metaphor that Alter Rebbe gives is, imagine you got the chance to meet the king. Not just meet the king, but you had the opportunity to actually embrace, give a hug to the king. A dream come true. Now, is there a difference if you hug the king during the summer, when the king is wearing just one garment, or during the winter, when the king is dressed in many, many layers? Would you say that if he's dressed in many layers, I feel like I'm hugging less of the king, I have less of a connection with the king than were the king to be wearing just a singular garment? You wouldn't say that. It doesn't matter how many layers, how many garments the king is wearing. In that embrace, I am holding onto and connecting with the king. Similarly, the fact that the Torah has come down here, and it doesn't have the appearance of the glorious essence, infinite light of God. It has the appearance of a doctrine, of a legal system, of laws, of commands, of physical behavior. That's true. But all of those layers, those appearances, are just the various garments that are clothing the essence of the presence of the King of God within them. So no matter how many layers there may be, know, however, that when you're doing that mitzvah or studying Torah, inside of that is the very essence of God's being. And by you acting and performing that, you are creating that special connection, which you can only achieve in this world, not in heaven. Taking the metaphor one step further, the Alter Rebbe says, when you're hugging the king, it's not just you hugging the king, but the king is hugging you back. You're embracing and being embraced by the king. As King Solomon says in the Song of Songs, Viminot techabkeni, the right hand of God embraces me. What's the right hand? What does that represent? The right side of God, as we learned, represents chesed. Chesed is that part of God that is the giving and the kind and the outgoing and outward focused level of God. That is the Torah. The Torah comes from the right side of God. As we said, the Torah, which is God's wisdom, which contains God's essence, traveled and came and descended all the way down into this world. But when it comes down here, it contains the very same essence of God as it is in its source. Like the metaphor of water that we said. Water is also very much compared to chesed. Water, as it comes down here, it's the very same drops of water as it is on the mountaintops and coming from the sky. And so to recognize that not only are you hugging the king when you're doing a mitzvah, the actual king, but the king is also hugging you and you're being embraced by the king in that same moment. What is the nature of hugging and being hugged by the king at the very same time? And what's the value of that oneness and that connection? That we're going to study in the next class in chapter 5. So I wish you a wonderful day and God bless you. We're actually going to study today the next chapter 5 because of the calendar structure of this Jewish year. So hang in there for the next part in this series.